The wind carried the smell of salt and smoke as the gray ship neared the American coast. 47 Japanese women stood on deck, wrapped in tattered uniforms and fear. Their faces were hollow, eyes sunken from weeks at sea. The Pacific stretched endlessly behind them, a graveyard of ships and men. Before them rose a land they had been told was made of monsters. Keiko Nakamura gripped the railing until her fingers bled. She was 23 years old, once a nurse in the Imperial Army, trained to dress wounds in jungles and burn the dead before they infected the living. She had been captured in the Philippines, found half-conscious beside a field hospital destroyed by shellfire. The Americans had not killed her. That alone made her suspicious. Every lesson, every broadcast, every poster she had seen since childhood had painted the enemy in grotesque colors. The Americans will torture you, her commanding officer had told her. They will strip the flesh from your bones, make you confess, then laugh as you die. Those words had taken root in her, a faith forged not from truth, but from fear. Now, as San Francisco appeared through the morning fog, that faith began to tremble. The bay shimmered with a strange light. Bridges arched like iron rainbows, and beyond them stood buildings untouched by bombs. Keiko had imagined a land of demons, but this city looked peaceful, almost sacred in its calm. Yet her body stayed tense. Lies could hide behind beauty. The women huddled together, whispering prayers. Some held amulets blessed by Shinto priests. Others clutched photographs of brothers who had died in the Pacific. Their interpreter, a small man with a bandaged hand, told them they would be taken to a military hospital. The words froze their blood. A hospital, that meant experiments, perhaps vivisection. They had heard the stories of Unit 731, the Japanese laboratory that dissected Chinese prisoners alive. In their minds, the Americans surely did the same. When the ship docked, a group of American soldiers waited on the pier. They wore crisp khaki uniforms, their rifles slung loosely, not in menace, but duty. A young sergeant stepped forward. He had freckles across his nose and eyes the color of faded denim. "Welcome to San Francisco," he said quietly, as if unsure how to greet his enemies. None of the women answered. They bowed their heads and then waited for the blow that never came. The journey from the harbor to Letterman Army Hospital was silent. The truck rattled through the Presidio, past green hills and white buildings surrounded by trees. The air smelled of pine and seaweed. Keiko could not reconcile it with the image of a barbaric land. Every breath deepened her confusion. Inside the hospital, American nurses moved briskly between wards, their shoes tapping across the polished floor. The smell of antiseptic was sharp but clean, not the rancid stench of field hospitals she knew. The women were given beds, real beds with white sheets. One nurse handed Keiko a cup of warm water and pointed toward a basin of soap. "Wash," the woman said gently. Keiko hesitated. Soap, a small white brick of luxury. In the camps, soap had been rarer than gold. She dipped her hands into the water. It was warm, almost painfully so after months of cold. Steam rose, carrying the faint scent of lavender. For the first time since her capture, she felt her muscles unclench. She wept quietly, ashamed that her tears might look like weakness. That night, when the lights dimmed, whispers spread through the ward. "Why are they treating us kindly?" one woman asked. "It must be a trick," another replied. "They want us to relax before the interrogation." But there were no interrogations, no punishments. Only doctors who examined their wounds, spoke softly, and took notes in neat handwriting. When an American physician approached Keiko's bed, she flinched. He simply smiled. "Where does it hurt?" he asked. She did not understand the words. but she recognized the tone. Concern, not command. He touched her arm where a bullet had grazed the bone. Then he called for another nurse and began cleaning the wound with care that felt almost sacred. In that moment, the world she had known began to crack. For years, Japan had taught its children that dying for the emperor was the highest honor. To surrender was to lose one's soul. The Americans, they were told, would desecrate that surrender. Yet these men and women healed instead of harming. They gave bread instead of blows. They asked questions not to humiliate, but to understand. Still, kindness was more frightening than cruelty. Cruelty could be resisted. Kindness demanded trust. That night, Keiko lay awake staring at the ceiling. She listened to the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore. The rhythm reminded her of home, the beaches of Yokohama, where she had once played as a girl. She wondered if her parents were still alive, if they knew she was here. She imagined their shame. A daughter captured, living under the care of the enemy. Sleep did not come easily. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw faces, her comrades burned by napalm, her patients dying in jungle tents. She had believed her suffering was righteous. Now she felt something worse than pain. Doubt. When dawn came, sunlight spilled across the white hospital walls. For the first time, she noticed how quiet it was. No sirens, no bombs, just the rustle of nurses' uniforms and the murmur of waves beyond the window. The light felt too gentle for a world that had been at war. In that stillness, she realized that the lies she had been raised on were beginning to die. Not by force, but by warmth. The warmth of water. The warmth of hands that did not strike. The warmth of strangers who, for reasons she could not yet understand, refused to hate her. And in that warmth, something ancient and buried began to stir. The faint, trembling seed of humanity. The second morning brought with it the ritual of routine and the quiet war of unlearning. The American nurse assigned to Keiko was named Margaret. Her name tag read M. Hastings, but the way the others called her, Maggie, betrayed a warmth no badge could capture. She was in her 30s, hair pinned tightly under a white cap, face marked not by makeup, but long hours and too many nights without sleep. She smelled of alcohol swabs and peppermint gum. And she smiled, not in mockery, but as a person who believed kindness was normal. Keiko had learned to distrust smiles. When Margaret first entered her room, Keiko sat stiffly on the bed, arms across her chest, body folded in fear. The American nurse pulled back the curtain gently, letting the morning light wash over the bed. She spoke as if to a child. "Let's take a look at that arm, sweetheart." Keiko didn't respond. Her English was sparse, anatomy terms, medical instructions, and the occasional battlefield phrase. But she recognized the tone, the cadence of concern. It was the same rhythm she herself had used when comforting wounded soldiers. That recognition cut deep. She turned her arm, slowly, revealing the still healing wound. Red crusted, angry with infection. Margaret's hands were warm, but firm. She did not recoil at the smell of decaying flesh or the dried blood. She simply cleaned, rinsed, dressed, her movements efficient, practiced, and strangely reverent. When she was done, she looked at Keiko and said the word again. This time slower, clearer, better. Keiko looked away. Shame had crept up her throat like bile. Why weren't they angry? Why weren't they punishing her? The other Japanese women were experiencing the same strange mercy. Bones that had been broken and left to heal crooked were rebroken and reset, with morphine and apologies. Antibiotics, unheard of in their military camps, were given out as casually as bandages. One woman, Ayako, had suffered from a festering leg wound for over a year. A surgeon spent 6 hours saving her limb. He wept afterward, not from exhaustion, but from relief. In the days that followed, small comforts became acts of quiet rebellion against everything the women had believed. Soap, shoes, toothbrushes, hot meals, served without guards, without barked orders, without fear. It was the food that brought the guilt crashing down hardest. The hospital mess hall served eggs. Real eggs, not powdered rations. Toast, butter, milk. The first time Keiko tasted white bread, she froze mid-chew. It was soft, sweet, so unlike the stale rice balls and moldy pickles that had been her diet for months. The flavors felt almost sinful. She thought of her younger brother, still somewhere in Japan, if alive. Of her mother, always hungry. Of Tokyo's smoldering ruins. They were starving. And she, the prisoner, was being fed like a guest. Some of the women couldn't eat. They cried over their plates. One knelt beside her bed, refusing meals until a chaplain gently persuaded her that accepting food was not betrayal, that nourishment was not shame. Each evening, doctors made rounds. Not once did they shout. Not once did they strike. Some tried to joke. "Looks like you're healing faster than my Uncle Sam's golf swing." The women didn't laugh. Not yet. But they didn't flinch anymore either. The hospital had no fences, no barbed wire. They were watched, yes, but never caged. One day, Keiko wandered toward the window near the hallway. She saw 2 American soldiers helping an elderly man into a car. One of them noticed her and tipped his cap. It was such a simple gesture, but it shook her to her core. Back in the ward, Margaret sat beside Keiko one afternoon and began showing her how to fold gauze the American way. She mimed it slowly, then handed Keiko the packet. The young Japanese nurse hesitated, then mirrored the movements. Fold, tuck, tie. Their fingers met briefly as they adjusted the bandage. Margaret smiled again. In that moment, it wasn't enemy to enemy. It was nurse to nurse, one healer recognizing another. That night, Keiko stood in the bathroom, staring at her reflection. The fluorescent light above flickered slightly. She barely recognized the woman in the mirror. Her cheeks were fuller now. Her hair had been washed. Her skin no longer looked like paper stretched over bone. She still wore the thin robe of a patient, but her back stood straighter. She remembered how they used to chant at the Army Hospital in Luzon. Rather death than dishonor. Rather death than capture. But what if that chant had been a lie? What if mercy wasn't weakness? The next morning, Margaret brought her a notebook. "For your thoughts," she said. "Or drawings, or even letters." Keiko opened it. The pages were lined and clean, each one an invitation to begin again. She picked up the pencil, held it like a scalpel, and hesitated. Then slowly, she wrote the first word she had learned as a nurse. In English, in small, trembling script. "Help." Margaret placed a hand on her shoulder. That's a good place to start. In a war that had taken everything, family, homeland, belief, this one word felt like the planting of a seed. Not of surrender, but of rebirth. The human body heals in silence, but the soul protests. Even as their wounds closed beneath gauze and penicillin, the Japanese women carried another pain. Heavier, invisible, stitched into the spirit like shrapnel. It did not respond to surgery or salve. It stirred at night. It whispered in memory. It fed on the sharp edge of guilt. For Keiko, the silence after lights out became unbearable. She lay awake, listening to the soft breathing of the women in neighboring beds, the ticking of the hallway clock, the distant foghorns from the bay. But beneath that quiet rose another sound, one only she could hear, the cries of dying boys, the hiss of flame consuming canvas tents, the voice of her superior officer shouting, "Never speak to the enemy. They are not men." But they were men. They were women. They were nurses who wrapped bandages the same way she did. They asked, "Where does it hurt?" just as she once had. That realization did not soothe her. It tortured her. Each kindness she received from the Americans cut her twice, once with gratitude and again with shame. She began eating less, not out of fear but out of grief. One afternoon, a Red Cross volunteer brought a small gift to each woman. A pair of knitted socks, handmade by American women for wounded soldiers. On Keiko's socks, a small tag had been sewn in English. Margaret translated it for her. "To someone far from home, may you heal quickly." Keiko's fingers trembled as she held the tag. Far from home. She had been told that the Americans hated her, that they saw her as a beast in human skin. But these socks, these soft, woolen things, had been made by a stranger who had never seen her face, who had sent warmth instead of hatred. The spell of wartime propaganda cracked further. Some of the younger women began asking questions, quietly at first. Do Americans believe in ghosts? Why do they pray before eating? Why don't they kill us? No one had answers. Only Margaret, who began speaking more slowly, using simple words. She showed them photographs of her husband, her children, her hometown in Kansas. She let the women touch the images. "This is my family," she said, tapping her chest, heart. The Japanese women had been taught to see Americans as a violent tide. Faceless, godless, greedy. But Margaret was none of those things. Neither were the doctors, who walked their rounds without barking orders, or the cook who offered second servings without scorn. Still, not everyone adjusted. One woman, Naomi, refused to speak at all. She sat by the window, day after day, staring at the sea. Her younger sister had died in the firebombing of Osaka. The news had come in a Red Cross letter 2 weeks prior. Naomi clutched it constantly, the paper thin and sweat-stained. She believed that surviving, while her sister had turned to ash, was a betrayal. Another, Misaki, asked to return to the camp. "This isn't right," she said in Japanese. "They're feeding us while our cities burn." Keiko couldn't argue. She only nodded. One evening, a chaplain visited the ward. He was an older man, with a soft voice and kind eyes. He didn't preach. He didn't carry a Bible. He simply sat down and listened. When he spoke, his words were simple. "We all carry wounds no surgeon can see. But grace is not rationed like food." The phrase lodged deep inside Keiko's chest. Not rationed, not earned. The next morning, she saw Naomi still at the window. The sea beyond was calm, a soft blue beneath the overcast sky. Keiko approached quietly, sat beside her, and for the first time, spoke English unprompted. "Today is gentle." Naomi turned her head, tears tracking silently down her cheeks. She did not answer, but she did not move away. Something began to thaw. Later that week, the hospital arranged a small walk outside, supervised, but not fenced. The women were allowed to feel grass again beneath their feet. A nurse named Gloria handed each one a sugar cube. "Welcome back to the world," she said. Keiko placed the cube on her tongue. It melted instantly, sharp and sweet. Her knees weakened not from the taste, but from the memory it triggered. Her mother had given her sugar cubes when she was sick as a child, a rare luxury. That moment returned in full color, as if war had not happened. She turned to Margaret. Her voice was small but clear. "My mother, do this. When I fever." Margaret's eyes misted. She nodded. She sounds like a good woman. Keiko lowered her gaze. She was. I don't know if still alive. Margaret placed a hand over Keiko's. Then we pray she is, and that she'd be proud of you. Not because of war, but because of how strong you are now, that night. Keiko did not dream of fire or pain. She dreamed of a porch in Yokohama, her mother folding laundry, the sun warming her back. The image faded by morning, but left behind a warmth that even war had failed to destroy. In time, the women began to speak more, not of politics or battles, but of gardens, food, and home. Words like sorry, thank you, and help began to form bridges. These weren't confessions. They were rituals of repair. The war had broken their countries. But inside this white hospital, filled with light and soap and silence, something else had begun, a slow, aching rebirth. There are wounds that close with stitches, and there are wounds that close when a stranger chooses not to raise their hand. In September 1945, 3 weeks after Japan's surrender, the American public was still learning how to look at their former enemies. Newspapers printed victory headlines beside photos of mushroom clouds. War bond posters still depicted fanged caricatures of Japanese soldiers, blood dripping from their bayonets. Even now, in the cafeterias of San Francisco, a whisper of Jap could curdle the air. But inside the whitewashed corridors of Letterman Army Hospital, something quieter and more dangerous to hatred was taking place. Compassion, not announced, not declared, just lived. Keiko had begun helping the nurses, not by order, but by instinct. She fetched towels. She folded sheets the American way. One morning, when Margaret arrived late and flustered, Keiko was already at the bed of a newly admitted American private, adjusting his pillow with the practiced calm of a battlefield nurse. The soldier, maybe 19, with freckles and a stitched-up leg, looked at her with wary eyes. He didn't speak, but he didn't pull away either. That was enough. Afterward, Margaret said quietly, "You don't have to do that, you know." Keiko hesitated, then nodded. "I know," but she wanted to. Not because she had been told to, but because her hands remembered their purpose: to heal, not to harm. That purpose, long buried beneath ideology and blood, had begun to awaken. Word spread among the American staff. The Jap nurse, some called her at first, not unkindly, just unknowing. But soon they stopped saying Jap. They said Miss Nakamura, or simply Keiko. The transition happened slowly, like ice melting in spring. One day, a young orderly, Thomas from Iowa, approached Keiko with a folded piece of paper. He scratched the back of his neck nervously. "My sister, she's a nurse too," he said. "Wrote this letter, told her about you." Keiko blinked, confused. He smiled. "She didn't believe me when I said you were kind." The letter was short, handwritten, neat cursive. "Dear Keiko, I don't know you, but my brother says you're teaching us something important. That kindness isn't about which side you're on. That maybe peace starts with nurses. I believe him. Stay strong." Keiko folded the letter slowly. Her hands trembled. No propaganda, no training manual had prepared her for this. For the idea that someone across the ocean, someone who should hate her, had instead written, "Believe him." Later that evening, she placed the letter under her pillow. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't absolution. But it was something older. Like the first green shoot rising through ashes, not all Americans were ready to see the women as people. One morning, 2 visiting officers entered the ward. Their medals glinted on clean uniforms. One of them, a colonel, paused when he saw Keiko helping a wounded Marine adjust his crutches. His voice was cold. "What's she doing here?" The nurse beside him answered firmly. She's helping. The colonel narrowed his eyes. She's the enemy. Keiko bowed her head, shame rising like a tide, but Margaret stepped forward. No, sir, she said. She's the reason half these girls are still alive. And she's saved more boys this week than you'll shake hands with this year. The colonel stared for a long moment, then left without another word. That night, Margaret found Keiko alone in the supply closet, sitting on a stool, silent. I shouldn't be here, Keiko whispered. I am... shame. Margaret knelt beside her. Her voice was steady. No, the shame is the war, not you. Then, after a pause, let me tell you something, Keiko. My brother was killed on Iwo Jima, shot in the chest. I hated your people for that. I did. Keiko looked away. Margaret continued. But you're not the man who shot him. And I'm not here to feed hate. I'm here to help the living. She stood up, brushed dust from her knees. Come on. That boy in 3B still can't tie his gown without your magic fingers. Keiko smiled faintly. Okay. Later that week, the hospital chaplain held a small, optional prayer service in the courtyard. It wasn't for religion, but for silence, for grief, for reflection. A way to hold what had been lost. Most of the Japanese women attended, not because they were Christian, but because the quiet felt like permission to breathe. Candles were lit. Names were not spoken. But memories passed between them like wind through pine trees. At the edge of the gathering, Keiko sat beside Naomi and whispered, My brother died on Okinawa. I don't know where his bones are. Naomi touched her arm. Mine too. No walls, no uniforms, no flags. Just two sisters of sorrow under a foreign sky, learning to mourn without permission. The days passed, and though the body healed faster than the mind, something had shifted. Keiko now walked through the hallways without flinching. The guards no longer escorted them like prisoners. The nurses called them ladies. The doctors asked for their opinions. The hands that had once been clenched in fists now passed bandages. The mouths that had once screamed slogans now spoke soft English. Thank you. Good morning. It still hurts here. War had taught them to hate. But healing, slow, imperfect, radiant, was teaching them something far more dangerous to hatred. Recognition. The realization that those on the other side had hands too, and stories, and mothers, and wounds that ran deep beneath the skin. By early October, the autumn light began slanting longer across the Presidio Hills, casting golden shadows on the windows of Letterman Army Hospital. The sea breeze had turned cooler, and with it came a strange new rhythm. One not of war, but of words. Language had once been a weapon, a tool of division. Every phrase in the enemy's tongue sounded like a secret, a warning, a trap. But now, language was becoming something else. A bridge built slowly, hand by hand. Keiko kept the notebook Margaret had given her tucked beneath her pillow each night, like a charm. By day, she filled it with new words. Not words of medicine, not the stiff syllables of surgery or anatomy, but words of softness. Bread, smile, sister, trust, warm, morning. She wrote them slowly, repeating them in her head like prayers. Each word was a thread, sewing together the torn fabric between one world and another. Margaret noticed, and she began to help. After her rounds, she would stop by Keiko's bed, sit at the footboard, and teach. Not like a teacher, like a friend. 1 word a day, she said. Not from a dictionary, from the heart. She started with forgive, then came hope, then home. Some words didn't need translation. One morning, Keiko gave Margaret a folded paper crane, delicate and pale from being made out of hospital tissue. Origami, she said softly. In Japan, 1,000 cranes mean long life. Margaret turned it gently in her hand. Then we'll keep folding. The other women began to follow. They started listening to the nurses more closely, mimicking their English phrases. It wasn't perfect. Thank you. I cold. Okay, no hurt. But the effort was sincere. Communication was no longer a battlefield. It was becoming a peace offering. For some, language became a mirror. Naomi, once silent and withdrawn, surprised the ward one evening by singing. Just a hum at first, a lullaby their mothers had once sung beside charcoal braziers in distant Japanese kitchens. The tune carried across the ward like smoke, low and soft. A few women joined. Keiko hummed too. Even Margaret stood still, transfixed by the haunting gentleness of it. What does it mean? One orderly asked, curious. Keiko translated in pieces. Song about moonlight. Baby, safe in mother arms. No war. That night, someone left a harmonica on Naomi's bedside table. By then, even the American doctors had changed how they spoke. They used gestures, drew simple diagrams. One nurse, a tall man named Fred with a cowboy drawl, started labeling things with tape: chair, door, smile. It became a game, learning not by grammar drills, but by living. Keiko found comfort in these simple signs. Every labeled word felt like a note passed under a prison door. A sign that said, "You belong here. You can understand. You are not enemy." But the language that left the deepest marks wasn't spoken. It was shown. One morning, the women were invited into the physical therapy wing. Most assumed it was another medical evaluation. But inside they found an open hall with wide windows and sunlight pouring through like gold. Rows of soldiers, American boys, some their own age, sat in wheelchairs, legs bandaged, arms in slings, faces pale but alert. Margaret explained softly. They're here to walk again. Some might not. But they come anyway. It was a room of the broken trying to become whole. The Japanese women were nervous. The soldiers too. There was a silence between them. Thick, uncertain. Until Keiko stepped forward, knelt beside a soldier with a wrapped leg, and said in clear, careful English, "I help?" He blinked, then nodded. She lifted his foot gently, helped adjust the strap on his brace. After that, the others moved too. Ayako offered a cup of water. Naomi picked up a dropped bandage roll. Yui, one of the youngest, made a boy laugh with a funny face drawn on a tongue depressor. It wasn't planned. It just happened. Like ice giving way to spring. Later, one soldier said, "They were supposed to be monsters. But she smiled like my sister used to." The therapists noticed. The healing improved. And slowly, the lines blurred. Names were exchanged. A few halting conversations formed. One soldier even asked Keiko if she'd like to write a letter home. He'd translate it. He said his mother worked at the Red Cross and could help. Keiko refused, gently. "Too soon," she said. But she smiled, and he smiled back. That evening, as the ward lights dimmed, Keiko stared at her notebook. She added a new word, one Margaret had used during their walk back: mercy. She whispered it aloud. In Japanese, the word for mercy, jihi, holds within it the kanji for compassion and grace. But in English, mercy felt different. Not soft, not fragile. It carried strength. The kind of strength it takes to offer peace to the person who once pointed a rifle at you. Language was no longer just about words. It was about seeing the human underneath the uniform. And for the first time, Keiko no longer feared being understood. She hoped for it. The telegram came on a cold morning, folded into a tight triangle, sealed with a red stamp. A sergeant handed it to the ward nurse with little fanfare, just another delivery among medicine slips and chart updates. But Keiko recognized it instantly. A Red Cross message. For a moment, her heart rose. Hope flashing across her chest like light on water. News from home. Perhaps her family was alive. Perhaps her mother had survived the firebombs. Her brother had made it back from Okinawa. Her father, quiet and stern with kind eyes, was standing on a pier somewhere, waiting. She unfolded the paper slowly, her hands trembling. It was written in clipped, neutral English. Family residence in Yokohama confirmed destroyed during March air raid. No survivors located. Keiko didn't speak. She didn't cry. She simply stood, the telegram still open in her hands, as if the characters on the page might suddenly change if she stared long enough. Naomi, watching from the far cot, stood and walked over. She touched Keiko's arm and read the paper silently. Then, without asking, she took Keiko by the hand and led her to the far corner of the ward, near the window that faced the sea. There they sat. Neither said a word. The fog rolled in across the bay like ash. It was not just her family that died that day. It was the last fragile thread that connected Keiko to the world before the war. The world of small joys. Chrysanthemums in the garden. The smell of grilled fish. Her mother's voice humming while folding laundry. Her brother's bare feet running down the steps in summer. All of it now dust. Margaret found her there later. She didn't ask what the telegram said. She didn't have to. Instead, she handed Keiko a folded blanket and sat beside her on the cold bench. "I'm sorry," she said. "That's not enough, I know. But I am." Keiko nodded slowly, then whispered, "Now, only memory." Margaret placed a hand gently over hers. Sometimes, that's where the healing begins. That night, Keiko did not sleep. She sat beneath the hospital lamp, writing in her notebook. Not in English this time, but in Japanese. Tight, neat strokes of kanji flowing down the page. She wrote her mother's name, her father's, her brother's. Then, line by line, she described her home. The crooked plum tree in the back, the cracked rice bowl on the kitchen shelf, the smell of ink from her father's calligraphy desk. She wrote not to preserve, but to release. Each memory set down on paper was a kind of funeral rite. In the morning, she folded the page into a paper chrysanthemum. The imperial flower of Japan, yes, but also the flower of mourning. She set it gently into the water basin at her bedside. It floated, turning slowly, delicate against the steel. The other women noticed. Soon, they too began writing. Not about war, not about politics, but about gardens, grandmothers, pickled plums, laughter in the summer rain. These small memories were what the war had tried to erase. But here, in a foreign hospital, they bloomed once more like wildflowers after fire. Later that week, the hospital hosted a gathering in the recreation hall. A simple idea. Music, a few games, cookies from the Red Cross ladies. Just a distraction, they said. But it became something more. The American soldiers came first, limping or rolling in chairs, sleeves pinned where arms had once been. Then came the nurses, tired but smiling. Then, carefully, the Japanese women. At first, there was a divide, a line between those who fought and those who were taught to hate. But then, a medic named Walter pulled out a battered harmonica and began to play. It was a soft tune. American folk, unfamiliar to the Japanese women, but not unfriendly. The room stilled. Even the men with hard eyes looked up. Then Ayako, shy and small, stepped forward with a folded piece of paper. She whispered to Margaret, who nodded and brought her to the front. Ayako stood beside the piano and sang, not loudly, not perfectly, but with a voice that wavered like smoke. It was an old Japanese song from before the war, about a fisherman's daughter watching the sea for her father's return. No one understood the words, but the room understood the ache. When she finished, there was no applause, just silence. And then, one by one, the Americans nodded. A soldier named Frankie wheeled over to Keiko, tapped her notebook, and said, "Will you teach me how to write peace in your language?" Keiko smiled softly. She took his pencil and on a scrap of napkin wrote, "Pinghur." He held it in both hands like it was something sacred. The war had taken many things, but it had not taken the capacity to see another's pain and offer grace. That night, before lights out, Keiko sat by her window. The stars were beginning to pierce the evening fog. Somewhere beyond that sky was Yokohama, or what was left of it. But her heart did not reach only eastward anymore. She looked around the ward, at Naomi gently braiding another girl's hair, at Margaret refilling the water basin, at the harmonica resting beside a folded paper crane. She whispered a prayer not to be heard, but to be true. May all enemies become human again. The day the letters arrived, it felt as if something sacred had passed through the gates. The Red Cross courier wheeled in a metal cart stacked with manila envelopes. Most bore American postmarks. From Kansas, from New Jersey, from dusty towns across the Midwest. Their addressees were wounded American boys recovering in wards throughout the Presidio. But near the bottom of the stack were 7 envelopes, thin and pale, marked with red kanji. Return addresses: Nagano, Kyoto, Sendai. Someone had sent letters to the Japanese women. Keiko's name was on one. She stared at it for a long time before touching it, not out of fear, but awe. The paper was wrinkled, the ink faded from salt air. The address was her old family name, written in a hand that made her chest tighten. Not her mother's, not her brother's, but from Kana, her childhood friend, the neighbor who used to share rice crackers with her on the walk to school. The letter was brief. "Keiko, I do not know where you are. I only know that you are alive. Yokohama is gone, but I remember you. I remember you singing on the roof in summer. If this reaches you, know that you are not alone." Keiko held the letter to her chest. Alive. Someone remembered. She wasn't a ghost wandering the ruins of war. She was still known. Naomi received a letter too. Hers came from a cousin who had survived the Tokyo firestorms and now lived in a farming village. She read it 3 times in one sitting, then passed it quietly to Ayako, who read it aloud to those who couldn't. Not all the women received letters. Some cried softly into their pillows, but no one envied the others. They only listened, held hands, shared silence. What they understood now, what war had tried to erase, was that grief did not belong to one side. In response, the doctors and nurses invited the women to write back. Not just to Japan, but to anyone. "We'll translate. We'll send them," said Margaret. Keiko hesitated. "Why?" Margaret smiled gently. "Because when you write something with kindness, it doesn't stay on paper. It moves hearts." That afternoon, the ward became a quiet flurry of paper and pencils. Letters to surviving family. Letters to ghosts. Letters to the future. Keiko wrote to Kana, "Your words are light. I thought I was buried under ash. But I remember the roof, the songs, the blue tiles. I am in a place of white walls. The nurses are kind. I help now. I am not what the war tried to make me." Then, on a second piece of paper, she began another letter. Not to a friend, but to someone she had never met. "To the mother of the soldier I bandaged last week. He had red hair and freckles. He reminded me of my brother. He thanked me in English. I understood. I wish you peace. I wish your son healing. He smiled before he slept. I want you to know that." She signed it only with her first name, Keiko. That letter, translated by Margaret, was sent to a house in Illinois. Weeks later, an envelope came back addressed to Keiko Letterman Hospital. Inside was a photograph, a young man standing beside a pickup truck, smiling awkwardly in uniform, and a note. Dear Keiko, I'm Tom's mother. Thank you for your kindness. He told me about you when he wrote. Said you had the hands of an angel. I lost another son in the war, but I believe the only way forward now is love. If you ever visit America after all this, you'll have a porch to sit on and tea waiting. Nancy. Keiko stared at the photo for a long time, then tucked it in her notebook beside the paper crane. Language now flowed like a stream between stones. The women no longer whispered only to each other. They asked questions in broken English, offered help without being asked. One woman, Yui, helped sew buttons for an American soldier whose hands shook from nerve damage. He said, "You're better than my mother." And everyone laughed, even Naomi. Laughter, real laughter, returned to the ward like birds in spring. The hospital staff noticed too. Fred, the orderly with the cowboy drawl, taped a sign to the break room. This ward is now a no-war zone. Someone added in pen beneath it, "Peace spoken here." And someone else, likely Ayako, added in soft kana, "Pinghe, Heiwa." The war outside had ended, but the war inside the women, that long, brutal siege of spirit, was still unwinding. Some days they stumbled. Some nights, nightmares returned. But letters became anchors. Not only the ones from Japan, but those written from one hospital bed to another. A new ritual formed. Every Sunday night, they exchanged folded notes, simple things. I dreamed of plum trees. You smiled yesterday. It gave me strength. We are still alive. Let us live fully. They weren't military. They weren't prisoners. They were pen sisters, bound not by orders but by survival. And through those fragile letters, stitched from sorrow, mended with hope, they rewrote what it meant to have once been an enemies. The day the uniforms arrived was the first time the women saw themselves again as nurses. Not as prisoners, not as enemies, but as healers. It was Lieutenant Hartley, the hospital's chief medical officer, who made the decision. He had watched quietly for weeks, observing how the Japanese women moved through the ward, how they offered water before being asked, how they learned the rhythms of American medicine without protest, how they bandaged wounds with the tenderness of those who knew war not from textbooks, but from the cries of dying boys. They've earned more than sympathy, he told Margaret. They've earned dignity. And so, one morning, white cotton uniforms, the simplest the supply closet could offer, were placed neatly on the foot of each woman's bed. No stripes, no insignia, just crisp white, unwrinkled, pure. Keiko touched the fabric as if it might vanish. She hadn't worn white since Luzon. Before the bombing, before the field tent collapsed around her, before everything she believed turned to smoke. She had dreamed of white then, in her youth. White meant service, healing, honor. Then came the blackness of war. Now, unexpectedly, the white had returned. Naomi stood beside her, holding her uniform with both hands. "We are nurses again?" she asked. Keiko nodded. "We never stopped. We only forgot." That afternoon, they wore them. There was no ceremony, no announcement. But when the Japanese women walked into the ward, white robes catching the California light, their heads held not proudly, but humbly, the room quieted. A young American soldier clapped once softly, then another, and then the whole room. Soldiers, nurses, orderlies joined in. Not loud, not triumphant, just right. The war had trained everyone to expect uniforms to divide. But here, white robes united. A color without nation, a purpose without enemy. Margaret, standing in the corner, wiped her cheek with the back of her wrist. "They look like they've come home," she whispered. Fred, the orderly, chuckled. Better dressed than I am, that's for sure. In the days that followed, the women worked more openly, not as patients, but as aides. Keiko was asked to assist in the surgery prep room. Naomi kept inventory of dressings and gloves. Yui, with her small hands, learned to set splints with precision. They still slept in the ward, still bore the weight of exile. But their hands moved with purpose again. There was healing in motion, in the rhythm of folding linens, in the exactness of checking temperatures, in the silent language between one caregiver and another. Even the doctors softened. Major Liu, once skeptical of allowing former enemy combatants near supplies, now trusted Keiko to prepare sterile kits before operations. Her hands, he said, move like memory. One day, an American GI with a mangled arm screamed during a dressing change. Keiko stepped forward, placed a palm gently on his shoulder, and whispered, not in English, but in tone. Something ancient and maternal. The screaming stopped. He stared at her through tear-glazed eyes. Are you an angel or something? She did not understand the words, but she smiled anyway. That evening, as the women returned to the ward, they passed a small notice pinned to the corkboard. Field exercise, all medical staff invited. Date, October 28th. Location, Fort Baker grounds. Purpose, demonstration of mobile triage under simulated combat conditions. Fred explained, it's a drill. Practice for real battlefield chaos. You're welcome to join. Keiko looked to Naomi. You think we do this? Naomi hesitated. We did real war. Maybe now we help prevent more. On the day of the exercise, a low fog blanketed the bay. Trucks rolled out toward Fort Baker, across the Golden Gate, into the misty fields once reserved for gunnery drills. Medical tents were raised, cots laid out. Actors painted with fake wounds moaned convincingly. The American medics, all young and half-trained, fumbled at first, clumsy with splints, unsure with morphine doses. And then, the Japanese women stepped in. Silently, surely. Keiko worked beside a boy named Daniel, showing him how to splint a leg using only a belt and broomstick. Naomi helped stabilize a bleeding chest wound. Yui rewrote a triage list with military precision. The officers watched in silence. By the end, one captain said aloud, "Hell, they ran this better than my last deployment." Another replied, "That's because they've seen the real thing." As the sun fell behind the ridgeline, Keiko stood alone at the edge of the field. The air smelled of eucalyptus and smoke. She looked out at the rows of stretchers, the makeshift tents, the mock wounded. And for a moment, she saw the jungle again. But this time, she wasn't afraid. She reached down and placed her hand flat against the grass. It was damp, soft, alive. A different battlefield. One where mercy was the only weapon. And healing, the only victory. She whispered in Japanese, "Let this be the last war I walk through." Behind her, Margaret called out, "Come on, we're heading back." Keiko stood, straightened her white robe, and walked, not away from war, but toward something beyond it. The letter came from Washington in early November. It bore an eagle in gold ink and the seal of the War Department. A short, formal document stamped with military certainty. Yet behind its language was a truth no paper could soften. The Japanese women would be repatriated. They were to board a hospital ship by month's end, to sail back across the Pacific to a homeland none of them had seen since the flames fell. The war had ended, but their place in America, temporary, extraordinary, had run its course. The ward turned quiet when Margaret read the notice aloud. Keiko said nothing. She only bowed her head and folded the paper neatly, placing it beside her now worn notebook, the one full of English words and names she had once feared. Ayako wept openly. "What if we return to nothing?" she asked in a hushed voice. "What if there is no one left to receive us?" Naomi's gaze was distant. "Then we carry each other." That night, The air in the ward felt heavy. Not with sorrow alone, but with something more difficult. The ache of parting from a place that had once been unthinkable, and now felt like a second skin. In the days that followed, preparations began. Vaccinations, clothing distributions, departure briefings. A Navy translator came to explain the ship's route. He spoke in careful, bureaucratic Japanese, clear but cold. But what he could not explain was how to return to a country that had been broken in body and belief, while leaving behind something that had begun to feel whole. Margaret stayed late that night. She found Keiko sitting alone near the supply cabinet, folding gauze pads as if they were origami cranes. "You'll go soon," Margaret said softly. Keiko nodded. "You scared?" A pause, then, "Not of ocean." Margaret smiled faintly. "I want to give you something." She handed Keiko a small box. Inside was a stethoscope, worn but polished. "This was mine," Margaret said. "From nursing school. I used it during Pearl Harbor, during everything." Keiko touched it with reverence. "I cannot take." "You can," Margaret insisted. "You must." Then she added, her voice catching, "You're going back to a place that needs healers more than ever." Keiko closed her eyes and bowed deeply. "I will carry your kindness." "No," Margaret whispered. "You are kindness." The night before departure, a farewell gathering was held, not official, not ordered, but willed into existence by the nurses, the Red Cross volunteers, and the wounded men who had once stared in silence and now spoke with open hearts. They decorated the ward with paper chains. Someone played piano. Fred brought in an American flag folded in a triangle, and Ayako brought out a small Japanese one. Hand-sewn from pillowcase linen and red thread drawn from hospital fabric kits. They placed the two side by side on the long table. Then, quietly, a nurse stood and said, "Not to forget the war, but to remember the peace that followed." Keiko stepped forward. She had written something, her first full page in English, and asked Margaret to read it aloud. Margaret unfolded the paper and began. "I came here afraid. I believed you would hate me. I was taught you had no heart. But you gave me water, and food, and soap. You asked where it hurt. I never knew enemies could do that. I leave not cured of all pain, but full of something I never learned in any camp: trust. When I return, I will say, the Americans did not burn me. They bathed me in light." No one spoke. Then the soldier with the red hair, Tom, whose mother had written back, raised a cup of lemonade and said, "To Keiko, to all of you. You taught us what surrender really means. Not weakness, but mercy." The next morning, the sun broke clear over the bay. The women were dressed in fresh civilian clothes, gray skirts, soft coats, donated by local churches and volunteer groups. No prison rags, no numbers on their backs. Just women, returning home. Before they left, they gathered in the courtyard where the American flag flew each morning. Keiko stepped forward and touched the base of the pole. She looked up, then back at the others. Naomi, Ayako, Yui. Nurses once more. Survivors always. Then she took the small handmade Japanese flag and tied it gently beneath the American one. Not higher, not lower, but together. The wind lifted both flags, tangled them slightly. Margaret stood beside her, eyes wet. "No more lies," Keiko said. Margaret nodded. "Only truth." The chaplain led a quiet prayer, not for nations, but for people, for return, for rebuilding, for peace that would not vanish with the tide. As the truck rumbled down the winding road toward the pier, Keiko turned one last time. Letterman Hospital stood still in the morning light. White against the golden hill, windows glinting like eyes watching a memory disappear. In her hand, she clutched her notebook, her folded paper crane, and the stethoscope. the tools of someone who no longer feared the enemy, because she had become more than what war had tried to make of her. She whispered, not to anyone, but to the wind, "I will remember the hands that did not strike." And the truck rolled on toward the waiting ship. The ship that carried them home was called USS Benevolence, a name so strange in its irony that Keiko stared at the brass letters for a long time, unsure if it was a mistake or a message. It wasn't a battleship. It wasn't a prison barge. It was a hospital ship. White hull, red crosses, nurses moving calmly across decks. The same gentle smell of antiseptic followed them aboard. The same soft clatter of trays. It felt almost like Letterman, except now. The ocean waited. Inside, their quarters were clean. Small beds lined the walls, each with folded blankets and a toothbrush laid neatly above the pillow. Some women knelt and wept, not because they feared what lay ahead, but because they now knew what they were leaving behind. The voyage was quiet. 10 days over the Pacific. No bombs, no sirens. Just the slow groan of water parting under steel. At night, Keiko stood by the railing. The wind tangled her hair. The stars above, cold and bright, watched silently. Somewhere ahead lay Japan. But which Japan? Would they be welcomed? Shunned? Would their neighbors call them traitors? Would their silence about kindness be taken as betrayal? She didn't know. But what she did know, what she had seen with her own eyes, was that everything she had been taught about the enemy had collapsed under the weight of a warm towel, a bowl of soup, a nurse who said, "You matter." And in that truth, there was no shame, only responsibility. They arrived at Yokosuka in the cold rain. Gray skies, broken cranes, rubble. The docks were half submerged, and the air smelled of damp earth and gasoline. A line of American MPs waited, but there were also Japanese officials, some from the Red Cross, others from the new government. All of them looked tired, worn thin by surrender. The women disembarked slowly, carrying only what they had been given: notebooks, letters, the occasional keepsake folded into cloth. When Keiko stepped onto the dock, her shoes touched homeland for the first time in nearly 2 years. But it didn't feel like a return. It felt like the beginning of a second life. She settled in Hiroshima, not by choice, but because no family remained to call her back to Yokohama. A Quaker relief group offered her shelter, food, and work. The city was flattened, but something stirred beneath the ash. Women organizing soup lines, children playing in streets made of ruin, old men sweeping temple steps with broken brooms. Keiko put on her white robe again, the one Margaret had pressed into her arms with trembling hands. She joined a makeshift clinic under a collapsed schoolhouse roof. There were no walls, no beds, only the wounded, the hungry, and those too numb to speak. She did not ask what side they had fought for. She only asked, "Where does it hurt?" In 1947, she began writing letters again, not just to Kana, but to Margaret, to Nancy in Illinois, to the Red Cross officers who had helped arrange her return. She wrote in English now. Her grammar was clumsy, but her voice was clear. "The children here play with melted spoons. We feed them rice and hope. I use the stethoscope every day. I think of you. I teach the girls how to fold gauze, American style. They smile. Maybe one day they will meet your daughters, and they will not know the word enemy." Margaret wrote back, "I keep your crane by my desk. I tell every new nurse about you. We all remember you, Keiko. Not as a prisoner, but as a healer, a friend." The letters continued for years. In 1955, Keiko was invited to speak at a nursing conference in Tokyo. One by one, she told her story. Not of war, but of peace. Of how she was taught to fear the enemy, but learned instead to listen, to forgive, to see. A young Japanese student asked, "Weren't you ashamed to accept help from Americans?" Keiko smiled gently. "No," she said. "I was ashamed that it took me so long to realize they were human, as I was." In her final years, she kept the stethoscope near her window. The notebook remained wrapped in linen, beside a framed photograph of a hospital ward in San Francisco. White sheets, sun through the windows, a group of nurses laughing around a table. And inside the notebook, on the last page, she had written, "The war told us who to hate, but kindness showed us who we are." She died in 1994, in a hospice surrounded by former patients, nurses, and 3 students she had trained herself. One of them was named Heina, born after the war, never having known it. When she was told Keiko had passed, she stood in silence, then whispered, "She never told us much about the war, only how to hold a hand." They buried Keiko beneath a cherry tree. The wind rustled through its branches, and folded into the soil beside her headstone was a paper crane. Yellowed with age, edges softened by time. Once made from hospital tissue paper in a ward where enemies had once stood in silence, waiting for cruelty and received mercy instead.